Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Forrest Wolper here, and welcome back to another reading live stream. As you guys can tell from the title, I am continuing to read in my Everything You Need to Ace U.S. History in One Big Fat Notebook. Uh, I'm reading from this book. I am going to be reading the second part of U.S. history. I'm also in the middle of reading these other stories regarding history of other countries and in some cases other cultures. But if you guys are interested in that, I'll probably do those as well. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin with Unit 2 of U.S. History. Unit 2, Colonial America, 1607 to the 1780s. The Americas were dominated by the Spanish and Portuguese in the 1500s. But the 1600s and 1700s saw new players on the east coast of North America. These colonists identified as British and also as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or Rhode Islanders. They did not identify as American, but after the French and Indian War, the colonists began to merge, based on the idea of independence from Britain. In the end, these colonies became independent states, which then joined to become these United States. Hold on, let me hold on a second. Chapter 5, Virginia, a cornerstone colony. Jamestown prospers and Virginia grows. The discovery in 1614 that tobacco grew well in the area around Jamestown led to a transformation and expansion of the colony. Early settlers began to build plantations. These pla- Those planters who did well could increase their wealth by paying for the passage of their wives and children or indentured servants to the colony. The House of Burgesses. These increasingly wealthy men wanted to participate in making the rules that governed them, like Englishmen in England were able to do. In 1619, the House of Burgesses, a legislative body, held its first annual assembly. Under the overall governance of the Virginia Company, the people had their own representative government. A little bit of things here. I'm pretty sure it's actually pronounced Burgess. Either way, Burgess, a citizen representative in local government. Legislative, having the function of making laws and, in reference to the House of Burgesses, imposing taxes. Representative government, government with elected representatives of the citizens. The Second Anglo-Powhatan War. The powerful indigenous societies of the Powhatan Confederacy already lived and farmed on the land the Virginia Company was giving away to Virginian settlers. There had been a period of peace between the settlers and the Powhatan, but as tobacco farms took up more and more land on the James River, on, the James River, the Powhatans, now led by Chief uh, P- uh, P- okay, hold on, let me do this right. Chief Opechancanough, Opechancanough. I'm trying so hard to say this name without messing it up. Chief Opechancanough grew concerned. When a royal Powhatan advisor was murdered by the English, the Powhatans knew that peace could not last, and staged a coordinated attack, killing 25% of the 1,200 settlers. The Powhatans retreated, expecting the settlers to pack up and leave. Instead, the settlers retaliated and the Second Anglo-Powhatan War broke out. Vicious fighting continued for the next 10 years. Hello, Daniel Perry. How you doing tonight? Since the Virginia Company could neither protect the settlers nor make enough money to justify the cost of defending the colony, King James revoked their charter. In 1624, Jamestown became a royal colony, meaning the king was in charge. He chose a governor to rule the colony in his place and abolished the House of Burgesses. After King James I's death, King Charles I reinstated the House of in Burgesses, Burgesses in 1629. Help wanted. In addition to resistance from indigenous peoples, the colonies faced increasing labor shortages. Due to insufficient food provisions, awful working conditions, and the resulting 50% mortality rate, the flow of indentured servants coming from England slowed. Settlers began using enslaved African labor in larger numbers, starting in 1619 when the first enslaved African captives were brought to Jamestown. This meant that enslaved people of African descent and indentured servants worked shoulder to shoulder on the same plantations, under the same terrible working conditions. As a result, some developed alliances like helping each other escape or start rebellions, and formed relationships and families. These alliances made landowners nervous. Blurry labor lines. At the same time, enslaved people were discovering loopholes in laws and using the legal system to fight for their freedom. In 1656, an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Key, the daughter of an enslaved African woman and her white enslaver, sued for her freedom and the freedom of her children. Her attorney was William Grinstead. He was also her husband and a former indentured servant. They sued on the basis that under English law, a child inherited the free or enslaved status of their father. In this case, the father was a free man. English law also forbade the enslavement of a Christian person, and Elizabeth was a Christian. Elizabeth and William won the case, and both Elizabeth and her children were freed. Landowners followed Elizabeth's case closely, knowing that the outcome would set a legal precedent that could empower more enslaved people to free themselves. In the late 1600s, former indentured servants were forced to the frontier to claim their 50 acres of land. The indigenous people who lived on the frontier retaliated, and the settlers demanded that the government protect them. In 1676, after Governor William Berkeley refused to send an aid in, a group of frontiersmen led by Nathaniel Bacon attacked the, the Pamunkey people, and the governor. Wait, hold on, I'm reading that sentence wrong. Let me try that again. In 1676, after Governor William Berkeley refused to send aid in, a group of frontiersmen led by Nathaniel Bacon attacked the Pamunkey people and the governor. Bacon's rebellion quickly ended when Bacon died from dysentery, but it was one of the first acts of rebellion by colonists. Race based slavery. Between the alliances formed by indentured servants and enslaved African people, and the loopholes that enslaved people found in English law, landowners and enslavers sitting on the Virginia General Assembly, of which the House of Burgesses was one chamber, began to revise and codify the laws concerning the enslaved people of Virginia. These slave codes included the following: 1640. Runaway indentured servants of African descent became enslaved for life. 1660. English servants who run away from their contract face harsher penalties if they run away with enslaved people. And there's two, and the next two here are in response to Elizabeth Key's victory in court. 1662. A child will inherit at birth the status of their mother. In 1667, conversion to Christianity does not alter the status of an enslaved person. 1669, It does not count as murder if an owner kills an enslaved person while punishing them. You can see how unfair this whole thing was. Especially the two that I said were in response to the Elizabeth Key's victory in the court. These were all pretty much made because the slave owners were a bunch, and this is going to be quite honest here, they were a bunch of sore losers because they didn't like the fact that this person who was enslaved and now free won their case, and so they're using these five things, especially the two, in response to that, as a means to try to act like they are superior, to keep their superiority in line. Yeah. These codes, over time, refined the meaning of what it was to be an enslaved person in the southern English colonies of North America. Virginians broke from English law to develop a homegrown definition of slavery, a race-based system of perpetual inheritable property. The codes also worked to keep poor white people from allying with their enslaved peers. In later years, while the plantation owners used these codes to reassure poor white laborers that even though they had it bad, at least they were not enslaved. Interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia until the Supreme Court ruled such bans as unconstitutional in 1967. Just a little bit of a tidbit they got there on the side of that paragraph. The beginnings of Black American culture. Enslaved people were brought from all over Western Africa and were spread out once they arrived in the Americas. Because of diaspora, because of this diaspora, enslaved Africans in the Americas formed new cultures built from their different backgrounds and their common experiences. Enslavers knew that people they came from diverse societies in Africa. They intentionally tried to erase African culture by separating people with the same background or language. Enslavers sent some people to work in houses and others to work in fields, and they mixed people from different societies together. Also, because it's highlighted, diaspora, for those that don't know, the scattering of people from their homelands to a variety of diverse places, usually not voluntarily, but through force or as refugees. Enslaved people in the southern colonies often lived to old age, unlike enslaved people in the Sugar Islands. Despite the enslavers' attempts to erase their culture and identities, enslaved people formed families and communities and developed a distinct African American culture that blended Christianity with diverse African traditions and languages. Religion. Many enslaved people adopted elements of slavery. Wow, Forrest. Way to mess up your words. Let me try that again. Many enslaved people adopted elements of Christianity. The enslaved Africans used the Christian faith to sustain themselves and to negotiate for work, free Sundays, and spirituals became a major element of their worship and resistance. Spiritual, a religious folk song created by enslaved African people in the Americas. Song, dance, and storytelling. Influenced by African traditions, song, dance, and storytelling were essential for building community. Songs boosted morale during work and communicated secret messages. Stories taught traditional African morals and cleverly poked fun at their white enslavers. Dance preserved African culture and provided joy. Family. Though enslaved people were not legally allowed to marry, families were the central unit of society. However, the domestic slave trade meant it was difficult for families to stay together. Enslavers would often split up families by selling members to different plantations. Once forced apart, many enslaved families were never reunited. Yes, there have been times where if you guys haven't seen this one movie, I highly recommend watching it. titled 12 Years a Slave. There's a scene in that movie where our main character and a number of other black people are being auctioned off and sold to other people. And there's one moment where a woman is just so desperately begging, pleading not to be separated by a family member from a family member. I think it was a baby or a child. So yeah, that's actually really sad when you think about it. But it also shows how much this uh the families cared about one another, even if they were up until that point where they were forcibly separated. Because again, they were treated like property. They weren't treated like people at all. And as it was said here in this book, they made it pointed out that while indentured servants had it rough, at least they weren't slaves. They weren't enslaved people. Think about that. Alauda Equiano was an enslaved person brought to Virginia from Africa in the 1700s as a child. After buying his freedom, he wrote an autobiography depicting the horrors of slavery, which helped influence British lawmakers to abolish the slave trade in 1807. Her, but slavery continued despite the end of legal trading. Virginia sets the stage. By the late 1600s, Jamestown and the colony of Virginia had become the first permanent English settlement in North America, the first English royal colony in North America, the birthplace of representative government in the United States to be, and the first slave society based on slavery. I don't think we needed to have that in parentheses, but okay. To take root in English North America. Virginia developed two fundamental American institutions, representative government and chattel slavery, setting the stage for the United States to become what it is today. Also, chattel slavery, the practice of one person legally owning another, involuntary servitude for life passed down to future generations. Protecting the right to a democratically elected representative government united the 13 colonies and pushed them to fight for independence from Britain. Defending the other institution, chattel slavery, divided the country. The creation of a society that required brutal enforcement of oppressive slave codes challenged Christian morality and established systemic racism in government institutions and culture. Chapter 6: The 13 Colonies. As the colony of Virginia grew, more colonies developed on the eastern coast. There were three types of colonies. One, chartered colonies, under the control of a joint stock company with a charter, like Connecticut or Rhode Island, for an example. Proprietary colonies, under the control of the person whose property the land was, for example, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And three, royal colonies, under the control via an appointed governor of the English royalty, for example, North and South Carolina and Georgia, which started as proprietary colonies and later became royal colonies. And this is pretty much the gist of it all, right there. Yep, the New England colonies were Plymouth/Massachusetts Bay, 1620, New Hampshire, 1629, Rhode Island, founded in 1636, and Connecticut, founded in 1662. Middle colonies: New Jersey, founded in 1624, New Jersey, founded in 1664, Pennsylvania, founded in 1681, and Delaware, founded in 1634. Southern colonies were Maryland, founded in 1633, Virginia, founded in 1607, North Carolina and South Carolina, both founded in 1663, and Georgia, who would join last, being founded in 1733. It should also be noted that if you looked at this, you'll notice two separate things. First off, you'll notice that this right here is pointing at what would later be Vermont, part of Vermont, and then you have this up here. Now you may be asking, now if anybody's asking, why does that say Massachusetts? Isn't that supposed to be Maine? That's because Maine was founded later. What is now Maine was part of Massachusetts back in those times. Just so we're all clear on why Maine is not called Maine at that point. Puritans and Pilgrims. Some people settled in North America for religious freedom. Catholics in England had been persecuted since the establishment of the Church of England, Anglicans, and there was constant fighting between Catholic and Protestant nations. Catholics weren't the only persecuted Christians. Puritans wanted to reform the Church of England so that it would be more pure, or closer, they believed, to the text of the Bible. Separatists wanted to start their own church from scratch. In 1608, many separatists fled England for the Netherlands. Later, they formed a joint stock company and were given permission from the Virginia Company to settle in North America. They thought of themselves as pilgrims, or one who travels to a sacred place as an act of religious devotion. The Mayflower and the Mayflower Compact. On September 16th, 1620, a ship called the Mayflower left England. Not everyone on board was a pilgrim. They were bound for Virginia, but after 2 months of sailing, they spotted land farther north in New England. They decided to settle there instead, where they could make their own rules. On November 21st, 1620, before they went ashore, the men led by William Bradford signed the Mayflower Compact, a covenant agreed to obey just and equal laws created for the general good of the colony in order to benefit the glory of God and the honor of our King of England. The Pilgrims landed at Cape Cod and later chose to settle at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. Also, covenant, an agreement or promise with religious overtones. Thanksgiving in Plymouth. That first winter in Plymouth, about half the pilgrims died from cold and starvation. The rest were saved when two indigenous people, Samoset and Squanto, helped them make peace with the local Wampanoag tribe, whose leader was Massasoit, and taught them to grow maize and other crops. That's where we get the myth about the first Thanksgiving. Yep. Yep. If you guys recall, I did watch a bit of a uh, Thanksgiving, like when I was watching the Thanksgiving special in November. I did also watch alongside the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving special. This is America, the Mayflower. This is America, Charlie Brown, the Mayflower Voyages, which is a bit of a. I don't think it's entirely accurate, but it kind of tells the story of. It still does kind of tell the story about the people that went to this new land on the Mayflower, as well as their life sometime after, like for a time up until their first feast with the natives, with each other and the natives of that land. So yeah, yeah. Now we're about to learn the history of these colonies. So prepare yourself. New England colonies: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Massachusetts. In 1630, led by John Winthrop, about 900 people settled in Boston. Their goal was to start a perfect Christian society, a concept known as on a hill, as a city on a hill. A general court was established to create local laws. It was made up of representatives, but only male members of the church, those who were elect or thought to be chosen by God, could vote. Elect, not elected, but thought to be chosen by God, as we just said. Meanwhile, the Puritans in England were feeling more and more threatened by religious persecution. Tens of thousands left between 1629 and 1640 in what is known as the Great Migration. King Charles I granted the Massachusetts Bay Company, a Puritan joint stock company, a charter to establish a colony near Plymouth, creating Massachusetts. Connecticut. Thomas Hooker, a minister, disagreed with John Winthrop's leadership. He led his congregation, a group of people brought together for religious worship, to found Hartford, Connecticut in 1636. Hartford and two other towns joined together to become their own colony, and Hooker drafted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the first written constitution in North America. Under the orders, male citizens who were not thought to be elect could still vote. Rhode Island. Roger Williams, another Massachusetts minister, believed that people shouldn't be forced to go to church, that settlers should pay indigenous people for land, and that church and state should be separate. His beliefs were so controversial that he was banished from Massachusetts. Even though it tells me what the word means, I don't think I have to say what it is. But just to be safe, banished means forced to leave or no longer welcome. Yeah, he was banished from Massachusetts in 1636. His congregation followed him and founded Providence. In 1638, Anne Hutchinson, a religious reformer, was banished from Massachusetts because she believed that ministers didn't need to be members of the elect. Another reason for her banishment was probably that she was a woman who spoke out. Hutchinson and her sympathizers founded Portsmouth, near Providence. In 1644, the area became the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Oh, wait, hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it. I'm pretty sure I missed something. Just forgot to read something there. Hold on a second. Oh, yes, I actually did. From Massachusetts. I forgot one key thing that they talk about in that section. The Salem witch trials. In 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, some young girls accused people of casting spells on them. A special court was formed to judge witchcraft cases. The court often forced confessions from the accused. People eventually admitted that they had made false accusations, but by the time the witch scare had ended, 19 people had been executed for witchcraft. That was one of the first times where people in the land that would ultimately become America, but not technically America at that point. That was the first official public scare that turned out to be a hoax. Pretty much. Turned out to be a hoax. But this was one of those hoaxes where people died because of people lying about it. And this is a life lesson that people nowadays they should learn. That their actions could have a consequences where somebody could die because of what they did, or they could get seriously hurt because they chose to lie about something. People need to understand that that can happen. Case in point, even with that hoax of that hoax that scary moment that turned out to be a hoax, people still died because They were willing to believe that there were witches, like that witchcraft was all over the place. Yeah. New Hampshire. In 1638, Anne Hutchinson's brother-in-law, John Wheelwright, fled Massachusetts for similar reasons. He led people who agreed with him north and founded the town of Exeter. The area became the independent colony of New Hampshire in 1679. King Philip's War. In 1675, three members of the Wampanoag tribe were tried and executed by the English for the murder of another Wampanoag. The Wampanoag chief Metacomet, known as King Philip to the settlers, son of Massasoit, believed that the British, see here, the trial may have been influenced by ergotism, a condition caused by consuming rye infected with the ergot fungus, which can lead to severe symptoms like hallucination. Yeah, that probably would be. Yeah, I could see it. All right. Hmm. Yeah, may have been influenced by that. Yeah. All right. Interesting. I don't know if that's a theory or an actual fact, but all right. But anyway, the Wampanoag chief Metacomet, known as King Philip to the settlers, son of Massasoit, believed that the British had no right to execute his people. Also, the British continued to take the Wampanoag's land despite Metacomet's efforts to compromise with the British. War broke out. War broke out. Hundreds of settlers and most of the Wampanoag, including Metacomet, were killed. The English claimed victory with help from their trading partners, the Pequot and Mohegan tribes. Afterward, the English expanded into indigenous peoples' lands faster than ever because they still believed that even though because they still believed that the land is still theirs, like because they how do I explain this? Because it goes back to where they just want to try to they just want to have more land at the expense of the indigenous people. And the indigenous people have technically had every right to defend their land because it was their land. What is the book you're reading for us? Oh, hello, Astrocritical. How you doing tonight? Much discussed theory. Okay. But yeah, I'm reading the. Even though I know there's at least one of the books that would probably be better for this, I'm still reading this because while it is technically something for middle school, at the same time, I found it interesting to read. Everything you need to ace U.S. history in one big fat notebook. Yeah, I do know that somebody pointed out of this one other book when I read the first unit of this book some weeks ago. Yeah, I remember that. I also found this one book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm in the middle of reading the series that this book based talking about American history is also uh part of. So that kind of interested me as well. Oh, excuse me. But yeah, someone did mention another U.S. history book. I can't remember the name of it, but it's in the comments. Yeah, yeah, that's the one it is. I don't know if I want to read it. Not because of the criticisms that have it going on, but also because it stops at a certain point. And I want to read books that are talking about that include modern day history as well as like old times. Because I'm curious to hear because I know that could some people could say, well, even outdated books could have some interesting information in it. Yeah, I know. But I do prefer reading books that have as close to modern history as possible, so that way that history alongside the history of the past cannot be forgotten. Even if people like to look at the history and think of it in their own separate ways, which is how they are. I can't control that. But yeah, that's just how I am. When it, which is also very ironic because I love reading about history. Honestly, history is now currently my favorite subject because I followed that whole choose their own adventure. Yes, you know what? Ironic. You know what's kind of funny with that comment for me now? I actually have a Give Yourself Goosebumps book, and I'm thinking of doing it in a way where I read the story and then we make the decisions based on the choices that are provided in the book. Where the people watching watching those streams could determine which page we go to. One, like if it gives you a choice. I'm thinking of doing that for that book. I think that'd be a very interesting thing to do, and if it's a pretty good, and if it does very well, I might do more of those kind of books in the future after that. So consider it like an experiment for that, you know. Or I might do it to where I might make a video. I might private it for a moment until I got all the pages dealt with, and then yeah, we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I'll think about that with that book. But yeah, that's how I'm seeing it right now. Hmm. The Middle Colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Starting with New York. New Netherland was a thriving Dutch colony. Seeing the large number of prosperous Dutch people between New England and Virginia, England wanted this land for itself. In 1664, England sent a fleet of warships to conquer the Dutch. Unprepared for a battle, the Dutch surrendered. The colony was renamed New York after the Duke of York, who got it as a proprietary colony. New Jersey. The Duke of York gave some of his land to Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret, who named it New Jersey. They attracted settlers by starting a representative assembly and offering large amounts of land. But because New Jersey had no harbor, it was hard to make a profit. They sold their shares of ownership in the colony, and the colony reverted to the king's control in 1702. Pennsylvania. New Jersey had a large population of Quakers, a religious group later called the Religious Society of Friends, who were said to tremble or quake before God and had been banished from New England. The Quaker beliefs in equality of the sexes, nonviolence, and tolerance felt like a threat to Puritans. King Charles II handed over land to Quaker William Penn in 1681 to pay off a debt Charles owed. Penn's family, er, er, Charles owned Penn's family. I had to say it properly because mistakes happen. Anyway, Penn established Pennsylvania, where Quakers would have religious freedom, and founded Philadelphia. It attracted thousands of people and became one of the largest cities in North America. Here's something interesting here. All right. The Mason Dixon line was originally a line of rocks laid down by two people named Mason and Dixon to mark the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And I also love how they got this one person doing where they're at the border between Pennsylvania and yeah, just laying down a line of rocks, and you got this one person here. Ah, can't we just draw this on a map? That's funny. I actually just thought of something here, but because it involves a figure that hasn't been introduced yet, I'm not going to say it right at this moment. I'll say it when we get to it. But it's really funny. Delaware. Penn also got land from the Duke of York. Delaware was south of his other holdings and was occupied by a large Swedish population. It was still officially part of Pennsylvania, but Penn let them govern themselves. The Southern colonies: Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia. Maryland, well, I say that like I'm starting a sentence. Maryland. George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, wanted to set up a place for fellow Catholics. He requested a charter from King Charles I in 1632. His son Cecilius inherited the proprietary colony and named it Maryland. Although it was meant to be a safe place for Catholics, Protestants moved in too, causing conflicts. In 1649, Lord Baltimore issued the Act of Toleration, which made it illegal to persecute any Christian for his religion. However, in 1654, the Protestants gained control of the local government and revoked the act. Persecution, for those that don't know, means punishment, harassment, usually because of one's identity. God knows how many times people get persecuted because of things they can't control nowadays. Jeez, cow. The Carolinas. Also, for those curious, Carolina comes from Carolus, the Latin form of Charles. After a civil war in England, Charles II became king in 1660. To reward the aristocrats who had supported him, he gave them a proprietary colony south of Virginia, which they named Carolina. Most people in the northern half were originally Virginians. Most in the southern half came directly from England, with enslaved people, attracted by farmland, religious tolerance, and self-government. It became difficult to rule both sides as one unit. The people of the more prosperous South Carolina split from the colony's rule. In 1729, North and South Carolina became royal colonies. And finally, Georgia. Georgia was the last British colony founded in North America. In 1732, James Oglethorpe received a charter from King George II to establish a colony for debtors, or someone in debt, or if we want to go even further, people who were unable to pay back money could be sent to jail at any time, and poor people to make a new start. The king saw Georgia as a buffer between the colonies and Spanish Florida. Oglethorpe had strict rules: no large plantations, no rum, few enslaved people, and no Catholics. Few settlers were actually debtors. However, Oglethorpe gave up on his plan, and in 1752, Georgia also became a royal colony. England expected a profit from its colonies, so England passed the Navigation Act of 1651, making it illegal for the colonies to sail to countries other than England, to use ships other than English ships, or go through ports other than English ports. The colonists soon saw the Navigation Acts limited their wealth by cutting back free trade. Many, many resorted to smuggling, conducted conducting illegal/secret trade. Yeah, this would probably be the start of where the colonists believed that the British were putting them in a position to hurt them financially. We'll get to the we. This is like the start of it. This is not like where it's going to be like a recurring thing. We're not there yet, but we'll get there. Okay, I was just making sure my light was still on because I couldn't see the green light. There you go, now I can see it. So if I don't see it on my shirt, I know it's off. Chapter 7: Regional Differences. As the populations of the 13 colonies increased from immigration and high birth rates, the differences between them became more prominent. Vast distances and poor communication also led to differences. They developed individual cultures as well as a shared American culture. The main differences between the colonies hung on pegs, PEGS, population, economy, government, slavery. Southern identity, plantations. The South had a lot of plantations that grew cash crops, including tobacco, indigo, and rice. Each plantation was run individually and people lived far apart. There was almost no manufacturing or other business. Tidewater aristocracy. Because plantations were large and few, a small number of wealthy people lived in the South. A tiny percentage of the population controlled almost all the money and power. The wealthiest planters lived along the Tidewater section of Virginia, which had good soil and navigable rivers, and shipped tobacco and other crops to England. Dependence on slavery. Even though only a small percentage of the citizens were enslavers, the agricultural economy depended on slavery. Population imbalance. There were many more enslaved people and poor people than enslavers. Anticipation of rebellions caused local governments to make slave codes even stricter. Elected representative assemblies. Starting with the House of Burgesses, most local government was in the form of assemblies. Often these assemblies were bicameral, or a legislature having two houses, with one house elected by the people and the other appointed by the royal governor. Northern identity. Town life. Life for New Englanders revolved around the meeting house and church, which were usually the same building. The meeting house where church-going men worked together to make laws, usually faced a town green, which was shared land that belonged to the town. New Englanders owned small farms for subsistence farming and lived close to their neighbors. Subsistence farming, producing crops to live off of, not for profit. Trade and industry. Unable to raise cash crops because of long winters and poor soil, New England depended on trade, mills, lumber, shipbuilding, fishing, fur trading, whaling, and craftsmanship. New Englanders were on average better off than Southerners. Use of slavery. With no large plantations, there was a small enslaved population. Enslaved people were forced to work in households and businesses. Northern merchants participated in the slave trade and profited from it. However, the northern economy did not depend on slavery. Puritan values. New Englanders adopted the Puritan values of hard work, modesty, and education. Massachusetts mandated, meaning to require, usually by law, schools in any town of more than 50 households. Puritan values did not include tolerance of religious differences. Middle colony identity. The middle colonies linked the northern and southern cultures. Mixed agriculture and industry. The middle colonies grew some cash crops, especially grain, as well as fruits and vegetables. They developed industries such as ironworking and forestry. Trade was made easier by access to Philadelphia and New York City, the largest ports in the colonies and the centers of shipping. Use of slavery. Enslaved people were forced to work both in cities and on farms. Some were able to make money when their enslavers allowed them to work as longshoremen or shipbuilders in exchange for a portion of the enslaved people's wages. A rare few enslaved people were able to save enough to buy their freedom. Mixed populations. With large immigrant populations and a tradition of tolerance, the middle colonies were home to the most diverse populations. Mixed government. The middle colonies used a combination of assemblies, town meetings, and royal government. Backcountry identity. The backcountry, or the western frontier, stretched along the Appalachian Mountains from the far north to the far south. and was populated by recent immigrants, former indentured servants, and indigenous societies that had lived there for centuries. Although it wasn't very far west, it had a Wild West atmosphere. Few people had large farms or enslaved people. New and unique American identity. Even though regional identities became stronger, a culture was evolving, with common history from a shared English background, disregard of indigenous rights, which led to the belief that land was cheap and available, not in the case in Europe. Not the case in Europe. Social mobility among white males, from lack of hereditary titles or classes. An emerging middle class from wealth and social mobility because of the lack of aristocrats and use of enslaved people instead of poor workers. Power for landowners because of the connection between land ownership and the right to vote. Tolerance, mostly, of religious differences because of religious diversity. Shared enemies from wars with indigenous peoples and French and Spanish settlers. Women worked in the home, cooking, cleaning, raising children, gardening, making soap and candles, etc., or running stores or inns in cities. Farming was mainly the job of men. Boys were often sent to apprentice with a master craftsman, while girls learned their crafts at home. Apprentice, to work for another in order to learn a trade. The English Bill of Rights. Changes in England meant changes in the colonies. In 1685, James II became king. He wanted more control. He made the northern colonies the Dominion of New England, a royal colony with very limited self-government. People on both sides of the Atlantic were unhappy with him. After 3 years, Parliament ousted him. His daughter and son-in-law, Mary and William of Orange, invaded and took over in the Glorious Revolution, called that because it took place without bloodshed. In 1689, William and Mary approved an English Bill of Rights, which limited the powers of the monarchy and asserted a parliamentary power. The British government continued to make laws governing trade with the colonies, but there was little enforcement in the colonies, a hands-off approach called salutary neglect. Also, it should be noted, I forgot to say this, even though it's common knowledge right now. Parliament, the legislative body of Great Britain, and we also have this on this paragraph, salutary neglect, good, salutary meaning good and healthy. Still, colonists believed they were full citizens of England and entitled to all the same rights as someone living in England. Considered one of the most important legal documents in history, the Magna Carta of 1215 forced the king at the time, King John, to obey the laws of the land. Ever since, British citizens have been determined to limit royal power and protect their rights. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening was a religious movement led by traveling ministers in the 1730s and 1740s. Through fiery sermons at outdoor revival meetings, Americans were encouraged to seek a personal relationship with God. Most famous ministers would include Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts and George Whitefield of England. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that emphasized human reason, scientific analysis, and individualism, and applied the laws of nature to politics and society. Led in England by such philosophers as John Locke, it held that a social contract ensured citizens' rights in exchange for obedience to the government. The Enlightenment influenced Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and most of the founding fathers. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment prompted Americans to debate political, societal, and religious questions. Both put forth the idea that there was equality, whether in the eyes of God or the eyes of justice, among all individuals. The New York Weekly Journal, containing the the Frefheft advices, foreign and domestic. Freedom of the press. John Peter Zenger, publisher of the New York Weekly Journal, was charged with libel, a printed statement that defames or misrepresents someone, in 1735 and was put on trial after printing negative statements about the governor of New York. The governor was an appointee of the king, and it was illegal to speak negatively about the king. Zenger's lawyers, Andrew Hamilton and William Smith, urged the jury to determine whether or not Zenger spoke the truth and convinced them that people had the right to do so. It was the beginning of freedom of the press. Alright, we're 3 chapters away from the end. Just an hour in already, alright. Out of curiosity, what time is it? Okay, not too bad. Alright. Chapter 8 Rising Tensions. Testing the Boundaries. As British colonists expanded westward, frontiersmen stole property and killed indigenous people who lived there. They also challenged French claims to the land. This map, as shown here, show it to you guys so you guys see what's being referred to. This map represents European claims to land, and that was already settled by indigenous people by the mid 1700s. Fur, ports, and fighting. Some French colonists were Jesuits or priests who aimed to convert indigenous people to Catholicism, Catholicism, but most were in the fur trade. They depended on the rivers that provided access to the sea and French markets and built forts along the rivers to guard against English attack. British traders had the same idea. They built the settlement of the Pickawillani in present-day Ohio in 1748. Hey, my home state right there. I'm sorry, I had to. I just had to do that. Anyway, the French responded by attacking Pickawillani. The British captured the French settlement of Louisbourg in Canada. France built more forts, such as Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania. Alliances. Seeing that full-on fighting was coming, the British and the French searched for indigenous allies. Perhaps because the French were fewer in number, traded European goods, and didn't steal indigenous people's land, the French had a better relationship with the local indigenous peoples. They had allies in the Algonquin and Huron tribes, as well as others. The British got help from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The indigenous societies' main objective was to protect trade and their own land, so they joined whichever side seemed less harmful. Albany Plan. The British colonies sent representatives to Albany, New York, to discuss defense. In June 1754, Benjamin Franklin presented the Albany Plan of Union, aka the Albany Plan, the first formal attempt to unite the colonies. The plan was to join to raise money, train a militia, an army of amateur soldiers put together in a time of need, and organize the government. But not a single local legislature was willing to give up its own power. So the colonies were left on their own to defend against attacks from indigenous people that often resulted in their defeat. Alright, guys, it's time to read about the one and only George Washington. In 1753, a 21-year-old surveyor named George Washington was sent by the Virginia governor to find French settlers in the Ohio River Valley and persuade them to leave. The French refused, so in 1754 the governor made Washington an officer in the colonial militia and sent him back with troops. In what is now considered a military mistake, Washington attacked a French scouting party that was on a diplomatic mission. Among the 10 people killed was a French diplomat. Afterward, Washington built a smaller fort, Fort Necessity, near the French Fort de Courtenay. Even though he had little experience and few men, Washington attacked Fort de Quesnay. He was defeated, but the attack was the beginning of a war. The French and Indian War, and Washington's actions made him a hero in Virginia. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Part of the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763. The French and Indian War took place between the colonies of France and Britain, the parent countries, and indigenous people who had allied themselves with either side or were forced to fight in the war. It became known as the Seven Years' War when Europe split into two factions, countries that sided with England and countries that sided with France, and war broke out across Europe. The French and Indian War was the first war that started in the colonies and spread to Europe. Meanwhile, the British didn't have a strong army in America. In 1755, King George II sent General Edward Braddock to command the colonial forces. George Washington warned Braddock that the European style of combat, his army's bright red coats and method of lining up in columns, would not work in the American wilderness against people who knew the land well and had a greatly different fighting style. But Braddock ignored the advice. He was soon killed in a surprise attack. The Redcoats took huge losses. Probably doesn't need to be said, but again, just in case, Redcoats, British soldiers, so called because of their official uniform of a bright red jacket. The British Secretary of State, later the Prime Minister, William Pitt, was determined to drive the French out of British territory. The fighting was costly, and he had to send more troops to replace the many who were killed. The tide turns. With additional troops, the British Army and colonial militia began to capture French forts. Fort de Quesnay became Fort Pitt, Quebec, the capital of New France. Seemed impossible to attack, but the British successfully ambushed the city under the cover of night. The Battle of Quebec was a turning point in the war. When Montreal fell the next year, all of French Canada was in British hands. Fort Pitt. Also, there's Fort Pitt, later Pittsburgh. That's literally the definition of Fort Pitt. Just later Pittsburgh. So why didn't it just say Fort Pitt and then in parentheses later Pittsburgh? Anyway, the Treaty of Paris. The French and Indian War and Seven Years' War formally ended in 1763 when Britain and France signed the Treaty of Paris. The treaty gave England all the French territory east of the Mississippi, as well as the Spanish territory of Florida. Spain had sided with France. Pontiac's War. British expansion made life worse for indigenous peoples. Trade with the British was less profitable, and more settlers were violently seizing land. An Ottawa chief named Pontiac united many different indigenous societies against the British. In early 1763, his forces took the fort at Detroit and attacked forts and settlements along the frontier. Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War continued until 1766. Over 400 British soldiers, more than 2,000 settlers, and more than 2,000 indigenous, or 200, sorry for that wrong number. So, doing it again, over 400 British soldiers, more than 2,000 settlers, and more than 200 indigenous people were killed. Pontiac signed a peace treaty with the British in 1766. He was killed in 1769. The Proclamation of 1763. To prevent more clashes between settlers and indigenous peoples, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, making it illegal for settlers to live west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered settlers. Some of whom had already purchased land past this border. The local government said settlers were entitled to the land and gave them permission to disobey the proclamation. The stage was set for more conflict. The British perpetrated vicious warfare against indigenous communities. They burned down food stockpiles and entire villages and offered bounties for the heads and scalps of any indigenous person. Settlers, not just soldiers, participated in this effort. There are also accounts of indigenous leaders being presented with gifts of blankets that have been intentionally contaminated with smallpox, causing a deadly outbreak of the disease. Yep. So, so that was another small step, but still something that's going to tell you that something big is about to happen. Still not quite there yet. Chapter 9. Parliament and Protests. The end of salutary neglect. The French and Indian War had been very expensive to Great Britain, or so Great Britain had a large debt. In addition, the expanding British territory meant that indigenous peoples were forced off their land by violence and deceptive treaties. England sent a standing army to America to protect the colonists from indigenous resistance, and those troops had to be paid too. Also, real quick, standing army, a professional army maintained even in a peacetime. In order to pay off the war debt and maintain the standing army England had sent to America to protect the colonists, Parliament raised taxes. You can see where this is going. The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered taxes on molasses that were brought into the colonies in the hope that it would minimize smuggling. Because customs officers were trying to stop smugglers, they searched ships and any suspected contraband could be taken away even before the smuggler was convicted. Colonists believed that the Sugar Act violated their legal rights as British citizens by denying the right to trial, and some went even further. James Otis, a lawyer in Boston, argued that Parliament didn't have a right to tax the colonists at all, since the colonists didn't have representatives there to debate the tax. Good point. The Stamp Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. Any printed paper goods, included legal documents, had to be taxed and have a stamp proving the tax was paid. The Stamp Act was the first direct tax to tax individual colonists. Protests broke out, including boycotts, in which colonists refused to purchase British goods at all. I actually I'm going to play a clip of this real quick. And I'm going to give credit to this YouTuber as I find it. Because, oh wow, I didn't notice they were doing the Hall of Fame tonight, but either way. I just want to say real quick, off topic, since I just seen that, congratulations to all the wrestlers that are in this year's WWE Hall of Fame. You guys deserved it in your own respective ways. But getting back to the topic at hand. I'm going to play a clip of this because it makes so much sense when you think about it. And I just gotta find it. Here it is. I just found it. But yeah, anyway, yeah. So I want to play a clip of Oversimplified, and this is essentially how it went down.
Shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungo Bear. Import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, Shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new check. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains everything? Yes, please. Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay. No. Don't do it. Stamp. Obviously, the colonists were like, hey.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it happened. Also, shout out to Oversimplified, a great YouTuber when it comes to talking about history of wars and battles and all that. Really good, and some historical events like talking about the life of Henry VIII or the French Revolution. You know, Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, etc., etc., etc. Highly recommended if if there are any kind of wars you want to learn about. Very much a good YouTuber that this man. Credit down to him for that video, by the way. All right, getting back to what we were reading. That October, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. They wrote a petition explaining how the Stamp Act was a violation of their natural and political rights. In March 1766, at the urging of British merchants who had been hurt by the boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but on the same day they issued the Declaratory Act, which basically reasserted Parliament's power to tax as it pleased. Also, even though it doesn't really need to be said because this happens all the time, repeal to undo a law. Hmm. Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. Boston businessman Samuel Adams agreed with Otis. He summed up Otis's position at a Boston town meeting in 1764 as no taxation without representation. It became a rallying cry. Adams was a co-founder of a secret society called the Sons of Liberty, which organized boycotts and protests, some of them violent. Women formed the Daughters of Liberty, urging Americans to use homemade rather than imported clothes and household goods. This was some of the first political involvement by women in America. Patrick Henry was a lawyer and member of the House of Burgesses. In 1765, he raised the cry of no taxation without representation in Virginia and inspired the Burgesses to protest the Stamp Act. Some people believed that these protests were headed toward treason, a crime against a government of which one should be loyal. Henry said, if this be treason, make the most of it, and implied overthrowing the king. The Townshend Acts. Parliament still wanted to raise more money to pay for British troops in America and the expenses of the French and Indian War. In 1767, it passed the Townshend Acts, which taxed imports, including tea. Colonists were infuriated by another tax being passed without their permission. They were also angry about the writs of assistance, which gave customs officials permission to search for taxable goods without a search warrant. Soon, tax collectors were among the most unpopular people in North America, and many went home to England to escape threats on their lives. The royal governor of Massachusetts asked England to send soldiers to maintain peace and enforce the law. The Boston Massacre. In 1768, 1,000 redcoats came to Boston. To the colonists, the redcoats were not there to help, but were occupying troops. On March 5th, 1770, a minor dispute broke out between a soldier and some Bostonians who threw snowballs at him. More citizens and more soldiers came on the scene, and a mob formed. In front of the custom house where the taxes were collected, stones were thrown, and some citizens dared the soldiers to fire. A few soldiers panicked and did, killing 5 Boston citizens. The event came to be known as the Boston Massacre. The 5 victims became heroes of the colonial cause, notably Crispus Attucks, son of African and Wampanoag parents. Lawyer John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams, argued that everyone, including the soldiers, was entitled to a fair trial. He and Josiah Quincy defended the soldiers, who were freed on the grounds of self-defense. The trial demonstrated to the world that the colonists were committed to justice. Boston Tea Party. Parliament repealed all of the Townshend Acts in 1770 except one, the tax on tea. People in Massachusetts were able to purchase smuggled tea. However, in 1773, when the British East India Company faced financial ruin, Parliament passed the New Tea Act, giving the company a monopoly on selling tea directly to the colonists and making taxed tea cheaper than smuggled tea. That reinforced taxes on the colonies and hurt local merchants who had made their living from tea. Monopoly, a situation in which one company has complete control of an entire market. Many colonists began to drink coffee to replace tea. On that note, as well. So that's where people started making it to where you drink coffee or tea. Personally, I drink tea more than coffee. But if you drink coffee, more power to you. I will not complain. Anyway, at midnight on the night of December 16th, 1773, while 3 East India Company ships were docked in Boston, the Sons of Liberty, disguised as indigenous people, boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was dubbed the Boston Tea Party. Because they considered themselves loyal British citizens, the colonists attempted to pay England back for the tea in exchange for a repeal of the Tea Act. However, the king and the parliament had finally had enough and were determined to punish the colony of Massachusetts. Alright, we are now on the final chapter, but it should be duly noted that the title of the chapter is, according to at least one historian that I heard about this from, it has been long believed that, uh, as the title of this unit of this chapter goes, uh, Paul Revere has been said to be yelling out, "The British are coming." Unfortunately, but some historians believe that he did not say that the British were coming, but that the Redcoats were coming. Because if you were to say the British were coming, it would make no sense because technically everybody in the 13 colonies were I won't say everybody, so I'll say a good number of people in the colonies were British. So it technically would not make any sense to say the British were coming. So they believe that Paul Revere said the Redcoats were coming to signify make reference to Great Britain's troops in the the Great Britain's troops. I love this joke here that they got before the first bit. How they have redcoats in a line, and you had one guy saying with the British are coming under that they have the line of redcoats, and they say, "Ooh, is it the Beatles?" Right, no, I'd have to say like a British person. Ooh, is it the Beatles? I believe they mean us, sir. That's funny. That's funny. Anyway, the First Continental Congress. Seeing the coercive acts as truly intolerable, In September 1774, the colonies sent representatives to meet in Philadelphia and figure out how to respond. This was the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress was the first time delegates from all over the colonies got together. Georgia was the only colony that didn't send representatives, but later they agreed with its decisions. Congress today is the legislative branch of the U.S. government, but back then Congress was just a fancy word for a meeting. Debate was about how to best oppose British policy or negotiate with Parliament. Patrick Henry, who told the Second Virginia Convention in 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death," argued on the side of war. Congress decided to put on a different kind of pressure. They escalated the boycotts. They sent a petition, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, to King George, informing him of the rights to life, liberty, and property they deserved as Englishmen. And they endorsed Suffolk resolves by the leaders of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, which called on colonists to form militias and declare the intolerable acts null and void. The delegates were hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. The Sons of Liberty strike again. Instead of repealing the intolerable acts, King George III sent more troops to Boston. So many people were spying for both sides that it wasn't long before General Gage, royal governor of Massachusetts, learned that the colonial militia was storing an arsenal of weapons in Concord, just outside Boston. In April 1775, he ordered his men to head there to destroy it and to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who also helped found the Sons of Liberty in nearby Lexington. On April 18, 1775, a Sons of Liberty spy came across a British regiment preparing to march. He ran to tell Paul Revere and William Dawes. William Dawes, also members of the Sons of Liberty. Revere asked a man named Robert Newman to help to keep watch from the steeple in the Old North Church in Boston. Newman was told to light one lantern if the British troops were coming by land, and two if by sea. When they saw two lanterns, Dawes took an overland route, and Revere rode across the harbor and took a midnight ride through Charleston and on to Lexington and Concord. As he rode, he shouted, "The regulars are coming out!" Secret code words to warn the colonists that the British were coming. Lexington and Concord. The local militia called Minutemen, they could be ready in a minute, heard Revere and grabbed their weapons. When the 100 redcoats reached Lexington around dawn, about 70 Minutemen were waiting. Both sides were ordered not to fire unless fired upon, and to this day, no one knows who shot first, but it was the shot heard round the world, starting the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The British quickly defeated the outnumbered Minutemen, killing 8 of them, and marched on to Concord. As the British were leaving Concord, they were surprised by more Minutemen at the North Bridge. The colonists killed almost 200 redcoats, using the bright red jackets as targets. The British retreated to Boston, and both sides pondered their next move. Colonists who supported independence were called patriots, and those who uh, remained loyal to Britain were called loyalists. Many loyalists fled the colonies, often heading to Canada. Initially, most indigenous peoples didn't take sides in the Revolutionary War, but the majority of those who fought supported the British. The British persuaded many tribes to fight against colonials settling in frontier regions. The Second Continental Congress. Since King George III continued to ignore the Declaration of Rights, the colonial leaders from all 13 colonies met on May 10, 1775, in a Second Continental Congress. They began to set up their own post office, make treaties with indigenous peoples, and serve as an impromptu governing body. They formed the Continental Army, with the Virginian George Washington as its commander. The colonial leaders, who were mostly from Massachusetts, chose a Virginian as commander to make the resistance appealing to Southerners. The Battle of Bunker Hill. Colonial William Prescott set up the Massachusetts militias on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, across the harbor from Boston. On June 17th, 1775, more than 2,000 redcoats marched up the hill. According to legend, the militias were short on ammunition, so Prescott ordered them not to fire at the redcoats until they could see the whites of their eyes. Twice the militias drove back the powerful British army. Although the British eventually forced them off Bunker Hill, the inexperienced colonial armies proved that they wouldn't be easily defeated. Excuse me. The Olive Branch Petition. On July 5th, the Second Continental Congress sent King George III one last shot at peace, the Olive Branch Petition. They still wanted to be part of England if the king would protect their rights. They urged the king to negotiate on disputed issues with recognition that the colonies should rule themselves on most matters. King George III rejected the petition and instead hired 30,000 German Hessian or mercenary troops to fight with the British. Let's see how that goes for them. Taking back Boston. Washington took control of militias and began creating the Continental Army to take back Boston. He came up with a plan to retrieve the weapons from Fort Ticonderoga, which a militia known as the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, and a Connecticut militia, led by Benedict Arnold, most famous for returning traitor and selling information to the British Army, had captured from the British earlier. Colonel Henry Knox and his troops hauled out heavy cannons from the fort over 300 miles by foot in the middle of winter. The Redcoats, under the command of Sir William Howe, saw that defeat in Boston was inevitable. On March 17th, 1776, the British retreated, fleeing north to Canada. I should also say, you know what, actually, just hearing about Benedict Arnold, I do gotta say, this is actually a really funny story I'm about to tell you regarding this man. So, before this happened, this story happened before Benedict Arnold turned traitor. Okay. The story goes that, and apparently there's a statue. There's a statue that could back up this claim. So the story goes that on one of his battles before he turned traitor, on one battle when he was on our side, Benedict Arnold broke his ankle. I believe it was either broke his ankle or sprained it or something like. He had an injury involving his ankle, and so to pay tribute to this, there is I don't know if it's still up, but there is or was a statue erected to honor Benedict Arnold's ankle. Like literally, it's just a statue of his fucking boot. That is the funniest story involving the man I've ever heard. Oh, that's just funny to me. Oh, yeah. Anyway, with that in mind, common sense. In January 1776, a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine wrote an anonymous pamphlet arguing for democracy and independence titled Common Sense. Paine blamed King George III personally, not just Parliament. Pretty radical for a time when most countries were ruled by kings who claimed to have God on their side. Common Sense sold hundreds of thousands of copies throughout the colonies and persuaded many people to support independence. And now the moment has come. The Declaration of Independence. June 7th, 1776. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in the Second Continental Congress calling the colonies free and independent states. Congress created a committee that included delegates Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson wrote it within 2 weeks, drawing on the ideas of John Locke. It was meant to explain the Lee Resolution. Before we continue any further with the dates, the Second Continental Congress came up with the national motto E, e pluribus unum, meaning out of many one in Latin. Also, resolution, a formal expression of an opinion. July 2nd, 1776. Congress unanimously passed Lee's resolution. John Adams figured this out. This date would become a national holiday. John Locke, wrote that all individuals have the right to life, liberty, and property. Property became the pursuit of happiness in one of the most famous lines of the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776. The delegates adopted the Declaration of Independence. The United States of America was born, provided the colonists won the war. And now we celebrate July 4th every year as Independence Day. And you know what the crazy thing is? Next year will mark 250 years since we gained our independence from the British. Interesting, isn't it? The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence has 4 parts. 1. Preamble, Introduction. 2. Declaration of Natural Rights. 3. Lists of grievances against the King. 4. Resolution of Independence by the United States. If you guys want to hear me read the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution, I do have a VOD of me reading the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution uh, from when I read it last July, because I remember reading it in response, partly because Independence Day, but also partly because of a recent event that took place at that point in time. So if you guys want to check that out, uh, be my guest. I highly recommend it if you would rather hear somebody read to you the Declaration of Independence plus the Constitution. Uh, if you guys want to do that, you know, like I always say, more power to you. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I'm just saying. But anyway, preamble, introductory section, grievances, complaints. From the preamble, quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. People must state the reasons for a revolution. From the Declaration of Natural Rights, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. End quote. Some rights come from the fact of just being human and can't be taken away by a king. When the founding fathers wrote all men are created equal, they meant land-owning white men. They did not include indigenous people, enslaved people, free black people, or women. From the list of grievances, aka the colonists' justification for separation. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of any absolute tyranny over these states. The grievances or complaints the colonists had against King George III, followed by a lot of examples. Tyranny, rule by an often harsh absolute power. From the Resolution of Independence, aka restates the Lee Resolution. Quote, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these United colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. Basically, they're saying we're independent. The Declaration of Independence in 40 words. Government is a social contract. If the ruler doesn't protect the people and their natural rights, the contract is broken and the people can overthrow him. King George III broke the contract, and so now the U.S. is its own nation. Put your John Hancock right here. John Hancock, President of the Congress, was the first to sign the Declaration of Independence. His signature was so large and stylish that people sometimes still call a signature a John Hancock. Yep. And that is the end of this second part. Next time, Unit 3, The American Revolution and the Early Republic, 1776 to 1791. That's all that we gotta read for tonight. And I will say, next time I do a reading live stream, we will be starting Death Behind Every Door. Be there for the story. You may or may not, you might not want to miss it. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this reading live stream. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole, signing off.